What we are going to introduce is, because remember, we could use Access, we could use MySQL, we could use a SQL Server, Microsoft SQL Server. So what we're going to do is we're going to work with a utility inside of this that's provided with SQL Server called the SQL Server Management Studio. So the good thing is you don't need to know a bunch of commands. There's a lot that we can do inside of SQL Server, inside specifically of the SQL Server Management Studio. And this is just a screenshot of it. What we're going to do is we're going to go in and demo this and kind of just explore what we can do in this graphical user interface, or GUI, to manage databases, manage the implementation of the databases, and even down to the table level of the content in the databases. So let's jump out and explore. We're going to go into a demo here, and let's go into our Contoso database. If you've gone to any Microsoft class, you've heard the term Contoso. We are going to go into, I'm going to go to Start and All Programs. And in here, you're going to see that I've got Microsoft SQL Server 2012. You'll see I've got SharePoint installed. I'm going to go ahead and expand on that. You'll see we have several tools we can use in here. We have configuration tools. If I expand on that, that's where we can use for some configuration options. The one we're most concerned with, the one we're going to spend the rest of today in, is the SQL Server Management Studio. So we're going to open this up, and when it comes up, it asks us to connect to the server. So we'll go ahead and perform that connection. And it brings us in to the left-hand side, we have what's called the Object Explorer. And the right-hand side, we have the Object Explorer details. So whatever we click on the left-hand side, it gives us more detail about it on the right-hand side. Let's start, first off, I talked about instances. This is an instance of SQL Server that's running here at the top level. I don't have multiple instances. If I had, I could use the same tool for managing multiple installations of SQL Server. We're going to focus on just one instance here. Now in there, the next big thing that we work with are databases. So if we expand databases, you're going to see I've got several different databases here already, including system databases that are automatically installed for every instance of SQL Server. So if we expand on that, you're going to see we have these 4 system databases. We're not going to get into the detail of those, but every instance of SQL Server has these 4 databases that are used to manage the infrastructure and the logical architecture associated with that instance of SQL Server. Now we also now have user databases. The rest of these, besides the system databases, with the exception of database snapshots, all of these here are user databases, or databases that we've created. We're going to be focusing on utilizing, for the most part in this session, or in these sessions for this class, the AdventureWorks 2012 database. If you've worked with a database before, see previous versions of this by any chance, you've probably heard the term AdventureWorks. So there's a flavor of it that you can use. Now, if you're seeing our demos, you're like, hey, I'd really like to explore with this, you can actually go up and download AdventureWorks 2012 and install it in your AdventureWorks 2012. If you're running SQL Server 2008, you can install it for that as well. So if you're looking at this, like, this would be pretty cool to be able to have this play environment, you can do so. Just explore, look for AdventureWorks, and download the flavor for your particular version of SQL Server that you're running, and you can be able to use that information.
And I think it's also important to point out that what you just showed very briefly in the initial view of SQL Server Management Studio, it showed that there were some objects, and I know we're going to talk about that later. But every database system, even Microsoft Access, has something similar. You can open Microsoft Access, you can look at the databases that are there. In that case, you'll see one at a time, but you can see the things that are in that database. And there are sample databases for Microsoft Access, just like there's AdventureWorks for Microsoft SQL Server. So if you wanted to try this as you're following along, you could load up Microsoft Access. You can find, I don't remember what samples ship with Access these days.
Northwind?
Is it still Northwind? Northwind is shipped forever. I'm not sure if it's still there or not.
I haven't opened up Access in a little while. So.
Yeah, but there are sample databases and there's open source databases, and you can see what sort of, you can explore the relationships and products and categories and things like that are a pretty common thing that you'll find in all of these samples.
Yeah, that's a great point. So we're going to be working on SQL Server Management Studio as our GUI, our graphical user interface for SQL Server. But that's a great point, Pete. I mean, it's like, okay, well, I'm used to sort of a spreadsheet right now. What's my next baby step? My next baby step would be maybe I try Access next. Get the idea of how that works, how the relationships work between the tables, and then go up to upgrade to the SQL Server environment. And there is a SQL Server Express flavor available too. So you may like, hey, I'm done with Access. I really want to go out and play with SQL Server. There's a SQL Server Express version that you can download It's free, so you can download that and get most of the functionality that you'll see that we're working with, even though we're working with the enterprise version. For what we're going to do in this class here, that express version will work for you. Okay, so over on the left-hand side, we've got this here. What we're going to be doing a lot of here as well is generating or creating queries. So up here, I can go in and execute queries in here. So I can do a simple query. This is the most basic query you can execute. And look at the IntelliSense. So it's helping me along with this. So if you're not quite sure, it's helping me along. So production dot and then products. Hopefully I did that right. We'll find out. Invalid object name. So I can hover over it. So it's all right. So I'm not sure. So we come over to the left-hand side. We go to our AdventureWorks. We go into our tables here. And you're going to see all the tables. Now, all of these tables, starting with human resources, all the way down here, are all used for this AdventureWorks table, or database, excuse me. So I was trying to use production.
I think you're in master.
And here's my products. And so it is an actual, I have an X on there. And so I'm going to go ahead and then I'm going to hover over it again. And you're going to see it's still saying invalid product name. Now there's two ways. What I haven't done is I haven't identified what database I want to use. So there, if I look up over here, right now it's using the master database. When I connect, it automatically connects me to the master database. That's one of the system databases. I don't want to work with that one. So I can do this a couple ways. I can come in here and drop this down and find my AdventureWorks. Now when I hover over this, you're going to see, oh, now we got what the item that you're working with. Now if you like to make sure you know what you're doing, another way to do this is to preface this with the use statement. And so I could do this as well. Instead of having to drop this down, especially if I'm going to want to write as much of this up as possible, I could make that part of the command and add in the text. Use AdventureWorks 2012. So we're telling it what database we want to look at. Now I want to perform this command here. So we're going to go ahead and highlight this. And this is kind of cool because if I have several statements in there and I want to execute just one of those statements, I can do so by highlighting the text that I want to execute and then hit the execute button or hit the F5 key. So we'll hit execute up here and we get a bunch of data. So here's all my rows of content with the columns. And like I said, this is the most basic, the easiest syntax that you can write is select asterisk, which means give me all the columns from wherever I want to retrieve the content from. So we'll be spending some time in here. Again, I wanted to kind of show you that this is the Object Explorer, and we have the details that are going to be showing up here. We're going to spend most of the time in the new query window executing queries that allow us to retrieve or insert or update content. But this is just a little bit of an introduction.
It's a sneak preview of Module 4.
It's a sneak preview of Module 4. We're going to do a ton more in here. In fact, I'm probably going to resize this so you can see some of the commands here that we'll be working with. But you're going to see for this database here, AdventureWorks, we have tables. We're going to introduce these views, synonyms. The fact I said that right the first time is good. I spoke too quick. Programmability, storage, and security. So all of these are per database. We're going to talk a little bit later on in security, so we'll get that a little bit more information and detail with that. All right. Anything else we should show while we're in here, just as an intro? Do you think of, Pete?
You know, I had a question for you. If you wanted to go back to that, you've said a couple of things that I think we should clarify.
Okay.
You used the word schema. Can you talk just briefly about what you meant by schema?
So really, what happens is when you create a table or a view, it has to be associated with an owner of that. So they're using the word owner or schema is where it resides and who has access to that and how that is stored in that database. So the schema or the owner of that item is used. This is a two-part name. So you actually provide the schema and the object name. You can actually go up to up to 4 parts. We won't get into again here yet. Actually, we won't get into in this specific class. So it just identifies where inside that database that content or that object exists.
So it sort of references kind of the definition of what that object is.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay, got it.
Right.
And then I think there's one other thing that we should talk about because we're not talking about it.
Okay.
In my example of the spreadsheet, we talked about that I have all of these rows and all of these columns, and it's getting kind of unwieldy to manage. And you've introduced this concept of a relational database that has tables that have used rows and columns that relate to records and properties. And that whole genre of sort of information, we kind of refer to that as data modeling.
Yeah.
Right? And we're actually not covering data modeling in this session, but it's a really important topic that you guys will want to go read more about, that is sort of the technique for how you decide what to do with that giant spreadsheet of information and break it down into the individual parts. And we're going to reference that sort of thing along the way, but I just want to point out that how you actually do data modeling and how you do the design of a relational database is not specifically covered in this session.
Yeah, and you're right. There's entire courses on that, and there's a lot to that piece. That database design is huge before you even roll out any data. So taking that very seriously and understanding what you're doing there will be really beneficial for you as you're looking at taking your ginormous spreadsheet and trying to get it into a relational database.
And we'll allude to some of those things as we go along, but I just wanted to call out that we're going to talk kind of about the mechanics of what a database is and how the pieces of it work, but the next thing you'll want to do when you actually create it is you'll need to understand that data and then do that sort of analysis and design of what the data model needs to be. So we'll see some of that along the way. I just wanted to point out that's an opportunity for further study.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, and it's a very, very important part of the process here. All right, so I don't think there's anything else in here. We'll be coming back. We'll be spending a lot of time inside of these SSMS, SQL Server Management Studio here. So let me go back here. Oh, that's why I didn't want to do this right there. And let's jump back into our slides here. Whoop. Where'd I go here? And where we were in PowerPoint, aren't we? Yeah, we're using that guy. Okay, so that's just a brief introduction to the SQL Server Management Studio. We're just going to wrap up this module with just a little bit of a review. Remember, a database is kind of taking your ginormous Excel spreadsheet and just creating multiple tables and setting up relationships, all what we're going to talk about. But it's simply a different way to organize that content. It's not only different, it's going to be better. You're going to see that we can generate reports, we'll just say, or retrieve content, and slice and dice that content in ways that we could not do in an Excel spreadsheet. Microsoft SQL Server, Access, MySQL are all examples that we can use for that. We talked about the idea of a database management system, or a DBMS. So you're going to hear that term, a DBMS, or an RDBMS, which is a relational database management system. And really, it's just a plethora of applications that allow you to perform different tasks associated with that database. We talked about, right now we looked at the database engine. I mean, there's reporting services out there. There's analysis services out there. Nothing that we're going to get into, but an RDBMS has several components that allow you to manage that content that's in your database. Your database server or servers, most likely you're going to have multiple servers, whether it be virtual or physical, are used for hosting the content, managing the databases, and making sure we've got high availability, we've got information that readily available. So that's managed using our DBMS on multiple servers, database servers most likely. And then where we're going to spend most of our time is in the SQL Server Management Studio. That's the interface that we're going to use inside of SQL Server for creating our databases and managing the content within the databases, as well as managing content or managing the logical infrastructure, the rollout, the deployment of SQL Server. So with that said, we're going to wrap up on this section here, and we are going to go ahead and take a brief break here, and then we're going to come back and continue in Module 2.